So we've discussed the different stores that make up human memory: sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. What we're going to look at today is how we move information from working memory into long-term storage. So how we do that behaviorally and what's happening in the brain when we do that. So think about, what's the best way to encode, commit to memory, new information like a phone number. Now, this is a task that today you never have to do because you can, immediately type a phone number into your phone and save it. But 20 years ago, this was like an important problem. How would you commit a phone number to memory? And so maintenance rehearsal, simply rehearsing the number over and over in your head, using your phonological loop, is a pretty poor way to do this. Elaborative rehearsal is much better. So you want to relate the information to yourself in some way. You want to think more deeply about it. And so we can distinguish here between what's called shallow processing and deep processing. In shallow processing, you're paying very little attention to the meaning of the information you're trying to learn and remember. In deep processing, you're paying a lot of attention to the meaning of the material you're trying to learn and remember. And deep processing leads to better memory, better retention. Craig and Tolvey in 1975, they ran this study where they asked participants questions about words. And the questions engaged different levels of processing. So, shallow processing versus deep processing. And the participants were later asked to remember these words that they had to think about. And so how does this experiment work? Well, you might be shown a word like bird, and you're asked, is there a capital letter in this word? The answer is no. This is very shallow processing, right? You're simply thinking about the physical characteristic of the word, what it looks like. We can move a little bit deeper here in terms of how we think about the words, and we can show you a word like train and ask you, does it rhyme with pain? So now you're thinking about the phonology of the word, how it sounds, right? So your thinking is a little bit deeper than just looking at the physical characteristics of the word. And, in this case, you would say, yes, train and pain rhyme. Finally, we get to this case where participants had to think about what words mean. So they're shown a word like car, and they're asked, does it fit into this sentence? He saw a blank on the street. The answer is yes. But the key here is that they have to think about, what the word means. This is deep processing. And so later, when participants were unexpectedly tested on their memory of these words, they found that, words that participants had to think about deeply were better recalled than words that only involved shallow processing, like looking at the physical characteristics of the word. So deep processing is key. Thinking about the meaning of material that you're trying to learn dramatically improves your memory of that material. Memory for material is also improved if you link the information to visual images. And so in Intro Psych, I talk about the method of Loki, right, where you visualize yourself taking some daily route. So it could be the route to the dining hall if you're on Acadia's campus. Pre-COVID, your walk to your local cafe, and you can associate different stops on that route with different aspects of the material that you have to learn. So if you link material to visual images, you're much more likely to remember it. And using this method, you're also relating the material to yourself, right? And there's something known as the self-reference effect, where words are better remembered if they're related to you in some way. And then your memory for material is the best if you actually generate that material yourself, right? So in this 1978 study, they had participants read word pairs like king crown, horse saddle, and lamp shade, and they had a different group of participants do something quite similar, except they had to complete the word pair. So they saw king-cr, and of course most people would say, oh, king crown, obviously. They saw horse-sa, and they would say, oh yeah, horse saddle, lamp-sh, and they'd complete that word with shade, lamp shade. And in the second case, in the case where participants actually generated half of the word pair, their memory of the word pair was dramatically improved. Learning material is easier if you can categorize it. And so whenever you're studying for any of your classes, you want to think about how the material fits together and group it into different categories, right? If I show you just a list of random words, apple, desk, shoe, sofa, plum, chair, cherry coat, lamp, pants, grape, hat, melon, table, gloves, very difficult to learn that list as is. On the other hand, right, if I show you the list grouped into fruit, clothing, and furniture, it's a bit easier to learn. And that's because the category actually acts as a retrieval cue. And so this makes the words easier to remember. So when you're trying to learn new information, you want to categorize it, organize it. This is related to chunking. So we talked about chunking in the context of expanding working memory. Same idea, but we can also use chunking like this to actually improve our memory, our long-term memory of information. So once you've learned material, how do you retain that information? So once you think you've learned something, how do you retain that information? Do you repeatedly study it? Do you repeatedly test yourself? Or do you do both? This study suggests that the best way, the most efficient way to actually retain material that you've already learned is to repeatedly test yourself on that material. And so the way this experiment worked, and I think a lot of undergraduates struggle with this particular experiment because it's very counterintuitive. It suggests that you should throw away your cue cards because they're doing absolutely nothing for you whatsoever. So the way the study works is that they had participants learn 40 Swahili English word pairs, like mashua and boat. They were then tested on those word pairs. So they're given one half of the word pair and they have to complete the word pair. And the trick here is that after you learned a particular word pair, you were put into one of four groups. So in group 1, group ST, word pairs that you had learned, you continued to study them, and you were continued to be tested on them. So you were shown one half of the word pair, and you had to complete it. In the second group, group SNT, word pairs that you learned were dropped from study completely, but you were still tested on them. So this is kind of like, the group where they throw away the cue cards, the flashcards. You're still tested on the material, but you're no longer just passively reviewing it. In group STN, word pairs that you learned were dropped from testing. So you're no longer tested on this material, you've already learned it, but you can still review it, right? So this is the group that keeps the flashcards, but they're not tested on the material that they've learned. And then finally, in the fourth group, group SNTN, once you've learned a word pair, you simply stop studying it and you stop testing yourself on it. And so a week later, participants in the study were tested on their knowledge of these word pairs. And what did they find? And this is kind of surprising. So participants who, once they learned a word pair, continued to study it and continued to be tested on that word pair, had very good recall of the Swahili English word pairs. They were up at like 80%. Participants who had, once they had learned a word pair, they continued to test themselves on that word pair, but they stopped studying the word pair. So this is the group that threw away the flashcards, and they just tested themselves over and over and over again. Their recall was similarly up at like 80%. The third group, and this is where things get surprising, in this third group, this is the group that once they learned a word pair, they were stopped, they weren't tested on that word pair anymore, but they continued to passively study it. So this is the group that just, uses the flashcards and just reviews the material. A week later, their memory for that material was down below 40%. And in fact, their memory was the same as the group that once they learned something, they stopped studying and they stopped testing themselves on that material completely. So this group that, once they learned these Swahili English word pairs, just simply passively reviewed that material, was equivalent to the group that just, once they learned the English Swahili word pairs, they stopped doing anything, they stopped studying altogether, right? So it suggests that, passively reviewing material that you think you already know is basically worthless. You want to test yourself on that material over and over and over again. And the idea here, what the authors are saying in the study, is it's actually retrieval, forcing yourself to actively retrieve the material. So when you see that mashua and you have to complete that word pair, forcing yourself to complete that word pair with boat, actively retrieve that pairing, promotes and strengthens learning. Very important study that I think all undergraduates should know about, because it really suggests that testing is at the heart of learning. So many failures of memory relate to failures of retrieval, right? So you've committed the information to memory, but you can't retrieve it. And this is where generating retrieval cues can help, right? So a retrieval cue could be like an acronym. There's a reason why, I still remember the colors of the rainbow, right? Because of that silly acronym, Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Even though I learned that acronym like in grade 4, that's a retrieval cue. And what's important is that you make these retrieval cues yourself. So in this 1986 study, participants studied 500 nouns, and they generated cues for each, or they were given cues generated by somebody else. And what they found was that when you generate cues yourself, retrieval cues yourself, this leads to better recall of material. So you want to generate retrieval cues. You can create acronyms, relate material to yourself, to your life in some way, and this will actively benefit your recall of the material. Now, another sort of aid for retrieval is remembering the material in the same context in which you learned it. And so encoding specificity refers to the idea that, we learn things in a particular context, and it's easier to retrieve that information if we're in the same context. And so I think this study by Golden and Badley, around in the 1970s, nicely shows that. This is in my view, the most ridiculous study in the history of experimental psychology, but it gets the point across. So they had scuba divers in the study learn a bunch of words either underwater, and that's the blue line here, or on land. And what do you see? If you're a scuba diver and you learn a bunch of words underwater, your recall of those words is better if you're tested on them underwater than you are if you're tested on land. On the other hand, if you learn a bunch of words on land, your recall of those words is better if you're tested on them on land as opposed to underwater, right? So your recall of information will be better if it occurs in the context, in the same environment in which you learned that material. And this is why when students ask me about, studying with music on in the background, I say don't do it, right? Because generally speaking, when you're tested on material, you won't have that music playing in the background, right? This year is maybe the one exception where we're, doing a lot of our testing online. You can literally write your exam in the exact same environment in which you learned the material, and this should benefit retrieval. So the context in which we learn information matters. The state in which we learn information matters, so your mood. In this particular study, they induced people to feel either happy or sad, and then put into this happy or sad state, they had to learn a list of words. And on the test day, they were put into either a happy or sad state, and what they found was that, if your mental state, if your mood during testing matched your mood during learning, your recall for words in this case was greatly improved. So we have, both context-dependent learning and state-dependent learning. The state that you're in when you learn something can impact your retrieval. If you're in a different state when you try to retrieve that information, your retrieval might not be as good as if you're in the same sort of mental state. So, effective study techniques. Number one, and so you can apply these to your learning of material in this course, for instance, take notes with a pen and a pad of paper. Many students now take notes via a laptop, and I do not recommend that. And the reason is because when you're taking notes with a laptop, you can literally write down everything the professor says verbatim. You're not actively engaging with the lecture at all. When you take notes with a pen and a pad of paper, you can't scribble notes as fast as the professor is speaking. And what this means is that you actually have to think about what the professor is saying and write down the most meaningful bits of information. And this act of engaging with the material in this way actually improves your memory of the material. So it's sort of like a trick to make you engage with material in a deeper way. And there's actually, been a study that it looked at this, and the study had this great title, "The Pen is Mightier Than the Keyboard, Advantages of Longhand over Laptop Note-Taking." And they showed that, taking notes longhand was superior to taking notes with a laptop. Study tip 2, relate material to yourself. So elaborate, use elaborative encoding, and create common threads between information, categorize material. Study tip 3, break studying up. So the spacing effect suggests that short study sessions actually aid memory. Study tip 4, generate tests and test yourself repeatedly, right? As we just saw in that sort of, surprising experiment. Once you know material, if you want to really retain that information, test yourself over and over and over again. Sort of blindly reviewing it is as effective as doing nothing at all. So test yourself over and over again. How do you test yourself? Practice problems, go back, redo the midterms, redo the quizzes, write your own test questions. I suggest this in all of my classes. I'm not sure how many students actually do this. If you do write your own test questions, let me know. One way to write your own test questions, right, is to go back and reword practice problems, reword midterm problems to make an answer that was originally incorrect correct. And then finally, replicate the study environment. Very important for recalling information. So we've discussed sort of at the behavioral level, right, how you encode, how you commit new information to memory. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the biology, what's happening in the brain. And I'll refer to a process known as consolidation, which is the transformation of new memories from a fragile state into a permanent state. And what we think is happening in consolidation is that new neural connections are actually forming. So memories are represented in connections between neurons in your brain. And when you learn new information, this results in a new neural connection, or that information is reflected in a new neural connection. And consolidation takes time. And we can see that by studying behavior. So this very old study, more than 100 years old now, they had participants learn 2 word lists. In one group, they learned word list 1, then immediately learned word list 2. And they were tested on word list 1 sometime later. In the second group, they learned word list 1, waited 6 minutes, and then learned word list 2. And they were tested on word list 1 sometime later. What did they find? The group that had that break between the 2 word lists had better memory for that first word list. Why is that? It's because consolidation takes time. It takes time for your brain to actually form these new neural connections that reflect new learning. And if you do something else, if you try to cram in more learning during this consolidation period, this can actually interfere with what you've just tried to learn. This is probably why the spacing effect works, why it's best to break up studying into chunks and give yourself lots of breaks. So when we talk about consolidation, we typically distinguish between synaptic consolidation, which is at the level of synapses, the connections between neurons, and systems consolidation, which is at the level of sort of brain structures, neural networks. And so in synaptic consolidation, the idea here is that learning and memory are represented by physiological changes at the level of the synapse. So Donald Hebb, famous behavioral neuroscientist at McGill, working in the 1950s, proposed this idea that new experiences are recorded by changes in synaptic strength. And this led to Hebb's rule: neurons that fire together wire together. What does it mean when I say, a change in synaptic strength? So the synapse is the connection, or the space between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. Presynaptic neurons release neurotransmitters that diffuse across the synapse and excite or inhibit the postsynaptic neuron. And so when we're increasing synaptic strength, what that means is that we're increasing the ability of the presynaptic neuron to excite the postsynaptic neuron. And this is known as long-term potentiation. So it's the strengthening of this connection between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. How does this work? When a presynaptic neuron and postsynaptic neuron fire at the same time, over and over and over again, the postsynaptic neuron actually inserts more binding sites in its cell wall, and these binding sites respond to neurotransmitters released by the presynaptic neuron. So before learning, we may say that the presynaptic neuron fires, it releases neurotransmitters. So presynaptic neuron is neuron A here, it fires, releases neurotransmitters that bind with the postsynaptic neuron, and we see this sort of low level of firing. As these two neurons fire together repeatedly, the postsynaptic neuron actually creates more binding sites, creates more sites for the neurotransmitters released by the presynaptic neuron to bind on. And so the presynaptic neuron releases the same amount of neurotransmitter, but this neurotransmitter causes greater excitation in the postsynaptic cell. And so we say that the synapse, the connection between the two neurons, has become strengthened. And long-term potentiation nicely explains things like learned associations. So for instance, classical conditioning, learning to associate a puff of air to the eye with a tone, right? Air is blasted into your eye, you blink. That air puff is paired with a tone over and over and over again. Soon you hear the tone on its own, and the tone causes you to blink. Long-term potentiation and Hebb's rule explain this type of learning really well. So that air puff causes a somatosensory neuron to excite a motor neuron, which causes that blink response. When the air puff is paired with a tone over and over and over again, the tone triggers an auditory neuron. Neurons that fire together wire together. That's Hebb's rule. And so as these neurons all fire together at the same time, the connection between the auditory neuron and the motor neuron causing the blink, which was initially weak, becomes stronger because of long-term potentiation. And soon that tone alone can actually trigger the blink response. And this is, Hebb's rule in action. What's nice about Hebb's rule is that it explains at the level of neurons how learning and memory occurs. There are very few behaviors that we can explain at the level of neural firing. So it's a very sort of powerful idea. So synaptic consolidation consists of changes at the synapse, strengthening of synapses. Systems consolidation is more concerned with how memories are reorganized in the brain, how memories change over time. And so what we know is that when you first encounter new information, new material, you have new experiences in your life, these memories seem to depend on the hippocampus. And as the memories age, they become less dependent on the hippocampus. So as time passes, these memories become what we call hippocampal independent. How do we know that? Well, something interesting about HM, which isn't discussed in introductory psychology, is that HM actually had some retrograde amnesia. So we present HM as this case of this patient who had hippocampal damage, could no longer form new declarative memories. Classic anterograde amnesia. But HM also had retrograde amnesia, but it was graded. So what does that mean? It means that experiences that he had just prior to his surgery were lost, were gone. But experiences that he had, months, years before his surgery were retained. So what does that suggest? It suggests that older memories do not depend on the hippocampus, right? You can have your hippocampus removed and the memories are fine. HM could remember his childhood. He could remember, how to navigate around the home that he lived in prior to his surgery. Newer memories, though, even if they've been consolidated, depend to some extent on the hippocampus. And so if you lose your hippocampus, you can also lose newer memories. And so this is why we think that memories as they age change and they become less dependent on the hippocampus. Now, last class I talked about the remember versus know procedure. And so I suggested that, episodic memories, experiences, are memories that you remember, right? You remember a particular episode in your life. They involve mental time travel. On the other hand, semantic memories are memories that you know. So this is just factual information. It's not tied to any particular episode. And so what we think is happening is that as memories become less dependent on the hippocampus, they lose their episodic character. And I discussed this a little bit in the last lecture, right? As memories age, they become more fact-based and less episodic. So you might remember the facts of a situation or an event, but you don't remember like where you were when the event was occurring. And so we think this change in memory reflects systems consolidation, reflects memories becoming hippocampal independent. So in this study, they had participants look at images that were to some extent random, so a pairing of an alligator with a candle. And they were told to imagine the two items interacting in some way. I don't know how an alligator would interact with a candle, but I guess, in my mind, I'm imagining an alligator swimming with a candle on top of its head. After they were shown a bunch of these items and asked to imagine them interacting, their memory of these items was tested. And they were asked specifically, do you remember the episode that you associated with each item, right? Or do you just, remember seeing the item? So this is the remember versus know procedure. And what they found was that, 10 minutes after learning, most people did remember this sort of fictitious episode that they had created, right? The alligator swimming around with the candle on its head. However, a week later, we see this shift, as we would expect, from remembering to knowing. They remember that they saw a pairing of an alligator with a candle, but they don't remember this fictitious episode that they created in their mind of the alligator swimming around with the candle on its head. Now, in the study, while they were doing this task, participants were having their brain scanned using functional magnetic resonance imaging. And what they found was that this change from remembering versus knowing was reflected by changes in the activity of the hippocampus. So a week later, pairings that participants remembered had an episodic memory of, so the alligator swimming around with a candle on its head, led to activation of the hippocampus. On the other hand, pairings that participants just knew, that they recognized, yes, I saw this pairing before, I forgot, the episode that I associated with the pairing, led to no activation of the hippocampus. So we're seeing here, this is, correlational data, but some evidence that this shift from remembering to knowing is paralleled by a shift from memories relying on the hippocampus to memories becoming hippocampal independent. And so the takeaway message, right, is that as memories age, they lose their episodic character and they become less dependent on the hippocampus. And so your hippocampus could become damaged, but you'd still have the memory. So in the standard model, in the classical model, when you encounter new information, it's consolidated and moved into long-term storage. Over time, this information becomes less dependent on the hippocampus. A newer idea, though, suggests that whenever we recall information, it becomes fragile, like when we originally encountered it, and it has to be reconsolidated back into long-term storage. And this idea is a bit scary in a way, because it suggests that every time we remember something, it's like we just learned that information again, right? And so that memory is fragile and it can be modified or even eliminated. And actually there's some evidence in animals, there's some really clever experiments in animals where they show that, a reactivated memory, so they have an animal learn something, typically a conditioned response, like learning to associate a tone with a shock, and then they reactivate that memory and they're able to actually disrupt that memory at the point of reactivation. and they can make the memory vanish. And this idea that every time we remember something, the memory becomes fragile and needs to be consolidated all over again, so refixed back into long-term storage, formed the basis for this film that you may have seen, The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. So in this movie, right, he's had this traumatic breakup, and he hires this company to basically go into his brain and delete the memories of this person, his ex. Before a memory can be deleted, he actually has to recall it. He has to relive the experience, because that sort of makes the memory fragile again, and then they can zap it and get rid of it. Now, most of the evidence that we have for reconsolidation comes from conditioned responses in animals. So these are very basic, non-declarative memories. Do we have any solid evidence in humans that reconsolidation happens for complex declarative memories? Kind of. So what we know, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the next lecture, but what we know is that when you recall information, the information does become susceptible to change, which suggests that it is kind of moving back into a fragile state. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about eyewitness testimony and Elizabeth Loftus's work showing that, recall of information, recall of eyewitness testimony of crimes is notoriously dodgy and riddled with errors. But this study kind of gets at this idea that when we recall information, it becomes fragile and susceptible to change. So in this 2007 paper, the researchers provide evidence for reconsolidation-like effects in human declarative memories. So the way the study worked is that there were two groups of participants. And on a Monday, so on the first learning day, participants were shown 20 objects. And the objects were actually placed into a basket. And their task was to memorize the objects as they were put into the basket. They came back into the lab on the Wednesday, and this is where the two groups diverge. So one of the groups was asked to just remember what they did on Monday. So remember that objects were put into the basket one at a time, and they had to memorize them. And then after this memory was brought to mind, they learned a second list of objects. The other group didn't get this reminder about what happened on the Monday, on the first day of testing. They simply came back in the lab and learned about a second list of objects. At the end of the week, both groups were tested on their memory for that initial list. So the 20 objects that were put into the basket one at a time. And what do we see? So the group that didn't get that reminder, so the group that came back on the Wednesday and learned about the second list of objects, their memory for the first list was actually quite good. And there were very few intrusions of items from the second list into the first list. So the memories were more or less separate in their mind. On the other hand, the group that had to recall their initial learning, their learning of list A, immediately before they learned list B, showed a huge number of intrusions of list B into list A. So what does that suggest? It suggests that the act of recalling this initial period of learning put that memory into a fragile state. And so when the recall was followed by learning of new material, the two memory traces sort of became jumbled up in their mind. And so there's some evidence here that when we recall information, it becomes sort of fragile and susceptible to change, and it can become tangled up with, current events in our lives. And we'll look at this idea a bit more in the next lecture. So we've come to the lecture review. What's the best method for remembering new information? What's the best method for remembering new information? You want to use elaborative encoding, right? You're more likely to remember new info if you group items together, relate it to yourself in some way, and test yourself repeatedly. Question 2, what's consolidation and what does it depend on? Question 2, what's consolidation and what does it depend on? Consolidation is the process of transforming new memories from a fragile state into a permanent state. And it depends on changes in synaptic strength. Question 3, what does reconsolidation propose? So what does reconsolidation propose? It proposes that recalled memories move into a fragile state and they need to be reconsolidated all over again, so put back into long-term storage. And when they're in this fragile state, they can actually be altered or even erased.